Okay, so welcome everybody to Masters of Destiny 2. And we were just having a little bit of a chat offline with those who've managed to join us live today. And it's really interesting how certain questions are being raised, how the ways of thinking and seeing and approaching the world and seeing what is happening in our collective reality are being assessed and looked at from a different perspective. And that is part and parcel of becoming a master of our own destiny, is being able to hold the bigger picture, which we're actually speaking about now, while we're also busy integrating the extent of the new frequencies and the new waves, if you like, that we now have access to. So we're going to continue with this grand cosmic journey. So in this particular session, where I've called it the Cosmos Speak, so it's really beginning to understand the language of the cosmos through the individual waves. And today we're going to look at waves 1 through to 5 in a little bit more detail and expand on some of the concepts and understandings. And there's a couple of recommended exercises that I'm going to give to you at the beginning. Now, I just need to say this to start off with, because for some reason, when I restarted my computer, I can't find the power icon, and I don't know if my computer's charging. So I'm hoping that it is. If it disappears at some stage into the session, I do apologize. We would actually have to pick it up again afterwards. But I'm holding thumbs that it is actually charging completely and not discharging, so that we can get through the work that we need to do. So I just needed to tell you that in case, because I don't know where the icon's gone and I was trying to find it before we started. Okay, so welcome. Here we go with Masters of Destiny 2. And there's a couple of quotes that I'd just like to start the sessions with. So this is one that I actually picked out for this session. And again, it's one of those paradoxes. It's by M. Scott Peck. And I really enjoyed it, because going through the material and pulling it all together, I recognized the depth and the breadth of information. So in a sense, the level of complexity, but there is also a graceful simplicity in the information. And I love this quote by M. Scott Peck, which is: abandon the urge to simplify everything, to look for formulas and easy answers, and begin to think multidimensionally, to glory in the mystery and the paradoxes of life, not to be dismayed by the multitude of causes and consequences that are inherent in each experience, to appreciate the fact that life itself is complex. And it is, and very often the solutions to some of the circumstances and situations that we find ourselves in are complex solutions as well, that need to take into account so many different perspectives or takes on individual situations. The irony and the paradox in this is that with each subsequent wave that we explore and achieve alignment and understanding with, we actually, as we go through the increasing complexity of life and understanding, we get to a point where we reach that place of simplicity. The irony is that we cannot get there until we've been through the complexity, and that is one of the paradoxes. So, in the New Age teachings and the New Age environment, we often see things like 5 steps to this and 6 steps to that, and life doesn't happen that way. Our experience of spiritual growth, our experience of discovering ourselves, is not a 5-step, 3-step, 10-step process. It is much more complex, much more expansive than that. So this is also avoiding the tendency that we sometimes have to oversimplify things. It's also important that we avoid the tendency to to make things overly complex because of the interference with the human mind. So we have this mind-heart bridge, the grace of the heart with the understanding of the mind, and it comes back down to this: to understand something, the quote from last week, to understand something is to be liberated from it. An understanding of necessity is achieved through experience and our journey through some of that complexity. So I hope that makes a little bit of sense, because there are paradoxes involved in this. And here's another one: simplicities themselves are enormously complex. consider the sentence, I love you. And that's fascinating because how many meanings does that simple 3-word phrase actually have? You know, how many levels of complexity can we actually discover in just 3 words? And each one is an individual perspective, and the I love you from the human perspective has an infinite number of meanings, whereas I love you from a spiritual, the highest perspective, actually has another essence completely and can lead into a multitude of different behaviors and alterations in behavior. So there we have this paradox of simplification and complexity, sort of simple sentence that has very, very profound and complex implications. So bear that in mind as we're going through this work, because it does seem to be, and it can seem to be complex, and yet, and it is to appreciate the mystery in that, because this by no means is an ultimate definition of everything. We do not have full and total access to the mysteries of the universe. Our brains are not yet wired for that level and depth of appreciation. We certainly have, over the last 2 decades, been given access to a great deal more of the mystery as a consequence of the 8th wave, for instance. However, our brains are not fully developed enough in order to comprehend the totality of that just yet. And part of the complexity simplification is this: it's almost like a triple Mobius strip, but I think it's actually it's one of the knots. I think it's called the Gordian knot. It's like you can't unravel it. In itself, it is an incredibly complex physics presentation, and yet it looks very simple. But the meanings and the understanding of it are just very complex. So it's just an image used to demonstrate the concept. And again, the quote that I used last week, which is this whole idea that knowledge plus experience begets understanding. So we are achieving knowledge through this process that is being translated into our experience. It becomes a new understanding in respect of our ability to relate to and to navigate our way through life. Okay, so what we're looking at in this particular session in our Masters of Destiny 2 is we're going to have a look at the cosmic operating systems and what we might term the cosmic GPS, our GPS. And it's an analogy that's been used in many different teachings. So that's the operating holograms and created realities, and that is really linked to the influence of the waves and the 9 waves of creation. The Akasha, a simple taken explanation from my perspective on what the Akasha is, because that in also in New Age language or 8th wave language is also something that's been made more complex than what it actually is. You know, you have to say pray, and you have to go through the Lords of the Akasha, and you have to do this and you have to do that in order to access the information that is stored within the universal fields and the spirals of time. You know, so there is a simpler way of understanding it, even though it is a fairly complex issue. But this is my understanding of the Akasha. We're going to have a look at waves 1 through 5, Mu, Lemuria, and Atlantis, and bring that and those concepts into the mix. Ancient cataclysms, the origins of trauma, because humanity as a whole is experiencing a fracturing of the psyche that goes back to the 5th wave that was actually born and birthed through the transition from the 5th to the 6th wave. So it really originated in the 5th wave. So the origins of trauma and the birth of the ego. And what's really interesting about all of that is you see an emergence in a lot of psychological circles and a lot of healing circles at the moment. There are developments in dealing with trauma. So it's dealing with trauma in this current lifetime, but the reason why some of that trauma has become more apparent is because everything is being brought to the surface from the previous waves as we are moving into the higher frequencies of the newer wave systems and holograms and aspects of mind. So trauma is a big, big issue at the moment, and the healing of trauma is paramount and tantamount to our access and our ability to access and work with the ninth wave. So we're going to have a little look at the origins of trauma, upgrading your brain and staying alive. So there's a couple of exercises at the end of this session that I'm going to share with you as well that will support in upgrading your brain. So that's essentially covering the essence of it. Okay, so let's have a look at this concept of operating systems and programming. So what we have, everything in the universe was birthed from light. So light is everything that we can see and everything also that we can't see. Light is the carrier of information from source. Okay, so light was birthed from source. Light was the first thing that existed in the universe. First of all, there was light, there was illumination. So light in and of itself, in relation to source, because it is an emanation from source, we could actually say is the hard drive. So source is the hard drive and light itself is the hard drive. But that hard drive, like a computer system, is useless if there's nothing that is actually operating, or there's no software or no program to actually give meaning to and give us the capacity to operate that hard drive and to work with that hard drive. So what actually gives meaning and initiates the programming of the source light, if you like, are the 9 waves. The 9 waves of creation, which are different bands of frequency, each containing different holographic units and components of information, are the operating system. And once we have the operating system, we can then add and become a co-creative aspect by programming the system, by programming the reality that we experience as a consequence of the information and the meaning that we attribute to our experience of the wave. So this is where the experience comes in as well. So through our experience, through our understandings, through our relationship with the downloads of information from the 9 waves of creation, we become the programmers of our experienced reality. And remember I said the last time, we don't create in isolation. We are being created in the same, at the same time as we are creating. So we are programming on the basis and coming to a place of meaning on the basis of the contents of the 9 waves, the operating system. So the 9 waves provide us with context and meaning for reality. Otherwise, we would just be experiencing empty space. We would have no molecules that stick together, that create atoms and shapes and crystals and all of the rest of it. We would just be aspects of the nothingness floating around in the void. Or just floating along on the waves of light. So the 9 waves provide us with context and meaning for our experiences and reality. And this is done through the neural pathways that have been laid down in our brains through the continuum of life. And what is significant to understand here is that with each subsequent wave, the information that it brings is a different neural patterning that enables us to interpret the information within that wave. So our neural pathways have constantly been changing as a consequence of our evolution through the 9 waves of consciousness to the point where we're at now. So when those in the New Age environment, you talk about, you know, sort of upgrades and changes to our brain, it's absolutely true. And we also have this aspect of neuroplasticity, which says that the minute we understand something in a different way, we actually create new and different neural pathways. So we're constantly raising the bar in respect of our capacity and ability to understand our reality. So the 9 waves give us the operating system and the framework within which to do that. And if we think about operating systems, you could think about the 9 waves as subsequent versions of Windows. You know, so we started off with a number of years ago with Windows 7 or whatever it was. And within Windows 7, you could only develop certain programs, the extent of which matched the capacity of the Windows 7 operating system. So what happened then was that Windows 7 was upgraded to Windows 8. Suddenly you've got new programs coming online because you're able to program differently with the upgrade in the operating system. So it's the same with the subsequent waves. So with the 8th wave, we perhaps went to Windows 9 or, sort of Windows 10. And now we're on the verge of actually moving of altering the programming and continually upgrading the programming because the operating system that we are operating within has actually been upgraded through the 9th wave. Does that make sense? Yeah, fundamental analogy. So along with that, all of our neural pathways are actually changing as well. So our brain is adapting in order to be able to cope with and add meaning and context to whatever the 9th wave holograms are downloading. This is a quote that to me makes sense of the entire journey through the waves as well, and our link back to the 5th wave, which is essentially what we are doing. We are building a bridge from the 5th wave to the 9th wave, which is where we're at the moment. And that is that we are tasked as human beings to build upon the foundation of the ancestors, to heal the fragmentation within our psyche and restore the integrity of our connection to source. And I loved it. This guy's name is Sethicus. He's actually a Scandinavian shamanic practitioner, very advanced understanding. He speaks often of the tree of life with reference to the Scandinavian cosmic tree, and brings it back to a cosmic understanding. Very, very powerful and deep thinker. And this ties in so beautifully with the 9 waves, because it is essentially the ancestors that we talk about are the modern humans. The modern humans were the first wave humans of what we term the 5th wave. And the 5th wave, all the First Nations peoples, they established the foundation. So they are our founding ancestors on the 5th wave. And it was their journey from the 5th wave onwards that their experiences that resulted in a fragmentation to the human psyche, which has been carried through right up to our current time, which led to this perception of disconnection from source. And so what we are doing now with the 8th and the 9th waves is that we are reconnecting with the 5th wave and helping to heal all of that trauma and all of the fragmentation right back to that level. So I think this perhaps gives some understanding of the extent and the depth of the work that we are doing. We're not just healers. Some people describe that also in a very simplistic sense. When we start drilling down, we recognize that we are healing the psyche of humanity through the work that we are doing. So every single one of us that does this work right back to and through the traumas, back to the original consciousness, if you like, of the 5th wave, helps to weave the new grids in respect of that connection to source. So just putting that into perspective, I just loved his quote because it ties in so beautifully with what we're doing. And that's what we are. We're building on that foundation of the 5th wave, the foundation of the ancestors in general, so that we can bring that healing into being. Now, there's a lot that's been encoded throughout time in mythology. And this gives us also sort of a little bit of insight into the mythologies of the First Nation peoples, the 5th wavers, the indigenous peoples, and how they languaged the creation myths, because the way that they related to the energies and the waves of creation would have been in alignment with their cultures, their environment, and their mental neuronal capacity to understand it at that time. So a lot of people dismiss the ancient stories as just pure mythology, whereas in essence there is a lot of fact. If we learn how to decode the symbolism and see through the mythology to the truth of what it is that they're saying, we can gain a lot from what they left for us in respect of their stories. So this is a Hopi creation myth. which I absolutely loved. And it takes us into the whole birthing of light, the birthing of the universal tree. So the world at first was endless space in which existed only the creator, Taiwa. This world had no shape, no time, no life except in the mind of the creator. Eventually, the infinite creator created the finite, Sotuknang, whom he called his nephew to establish the 9 universes or worlds. And this is really fascinating because you can begin to see some of the analogies with the 9 worlds, the 9 waves, the initial shape that was given to the universe in respect of some definition. So it's something finite and defined that is born from the infinite. So it again comes back to this paradox, if you like, of this understanding our interconnectedness while understanding our sovereignty and those boundaries, and the finite within that infinite at the same time, because we do exist in both. And that was from the very birthing of reality itself, from the very initial waves. Also, there is a very generally held view amongst all of the original peoples is that the creational energy that was used or that gave birth to life itself was actually feminine. So the mind of the creator was ultimately feminine. And that understanding has become distorted also through recent waves and through time. So hence our need to return to the feminine. So I love this image of the Hopi creation myth because this is grandmother spider. There's a little talk about it just now. But I also really, really enjoyed this because symbolically you will actually see, you can see what I'm seeing in the drawing. Grandmother spider weaving the web of reality to actually connect everything. And of course, what do you see within the geometric configurations and the weaving of the web? It's against a background tapestry, which is all diamonds. So it's almost like a subliminal message there again, reminding us of the ultimate diehold, the original nature of source. So Sochignang was the finite. You could say that Sochignang in the Hopi myth is the equivalent of the tree, because the tree is that from which the 9 worlds emanates. So Sochignang was called his nephew, and that was the tree. Sochignang also created then Spider Woman, who served as a messenger for the creator, the woman, the intermediary, the feminine form, messenger for the creator, and was an intercessor between the source and the people. So a woman, feminine, the female energy, serpents, waves, connecting source with the life that is actually being birthed, with people, with the development of life. So that's also an interesting development, is that what intercedes in respect of bringing messages and information from source is a divine feminine representation of source. From source. In some versions of the Hopi creation myth, it is she who creates all life under the direction of Sotuknang. So you've got the tree with the waves, and then you've got this feminine force that is actually giving birth to subsequent life forms, through which the source, waves, and information can be experienced. So Spider Woman is a metaphor for she who creates from a central source. One day it is she who will pull all of her creation back to source. Her web represents the grids of the grids or matrix of our reality, the spider web effect. Spider Woman's web links you to everything and everybody in our reality. It is how we learn to be psychic and to connect telepathically. So again, I'm going to say that that web that has been woven, that serves as the conduit and the interconnectivity between all of these aspects, is ultimately the diamond grid. It interconnects all of the waves. It interconnects all of reality. We know that when we work inherently within that sacred geometric form, that it amplifies our capacity and ability to connect with more aspects and elements of source. Okay, so it's just looking at the symbolism, and if we go through, I mean, I'm not going to cover it here, but if you explore some of the other creation myths, you will find some similarities in respect of how they're expressed. So it's just looking through those to establish and to connect with the truth of what it is that they are representing. So there's some more connections that I'm going to highlight here. Is that okay, guys? Are you comfortable with that at the moment? Because thank you. So this does link us ultimately to the 9 waves. So this, yeah, the 9's encoded in everything, and this I love because this is something that defines our journey and also gives meaning to our journey. So modern scientific experiments, modern scientific work are adding attributes to the meaning of our journey. And I really enjoyed this. This was soul of man, you are like water, and water flows. Destiny of man, you are like the wind. So soul of man, like water, is that which flows through our lives, that flows through us and is given expression in life itself. Destiny, you are like the wind. Destiny, it's kind of like, it is that which blows, which is intangible. Destiny is what we create as a consequence of our embodiment of soul, of being in the flow of that water. Does that make sense? It's just, again, one of those quotes that I loved, and I thought it just makes such beautiful sense. We are purifying on this journey our individual embodiments of soul so that the memory of our beauty and essence becomes the guide for our destiny and others. And to me, that's my condensation of what it is that we are doing with this work and what we are doing in respect of realizing and becoming masters of our destiny. We are purifying every step we take. We're purifying our individual embodiments of soul through the work with the 9 waves. We're healing the fracturing of the psyche. And what's really important in respect of this, well, I just wanted to highlight this, is the beauty and the perfection of the geometry. You will all have seen this previously, Masaru Emoto's work, that when something is toxic and it is disconnected from source, so it's poisoned, it's distorted, it loses its ability to shape itself in accordance with the beauty and the perfection of those universal crystallized forms. So each one of these represents a crystallized form that's just identified by a word, which represent our connection to higher truths, to higher frequencies and higher ways of being. Whenever we actually see these here, you see polluted water, you see evil, you see you make me sick. The water itself, which is representative of our soul, loses all of its structure and its finesse and its beauty. So through our process of purification of our thoughts, of our behaviors, of our attitudes towards life, etc., that we are enhancing the memory of our beauty and essence in the same way that these crystals demonstrate to us the beauty of water in its purified highest form. So it was just these, you know, sort of these links between water, soul essence, structure, form, and beauty. So there is a structure that is evident in our developmental framework that is important. And that's what we're restoring. So let's have a look. What I've just, we did this chart in the first workshop masterclass. I'm just putting it up here because what we're going to do is we're going to have a look here at waves 1 through 5. So it's just to reiterate the time scales of these particular waves and the frequencies, and the birth of matter some 16.5 billion years ago. Then plants and animals that developed from that about 820 million years ago, to the birthing of primates 41 million years ago, to the first human beings approximately 2 million years ago, and then the development of the First Nations peoples approximately 103,000 years ago. This really vast leap, an evolutionary leap in the capacity of the brains, in how people were thinking, behaving, and defining their environments as a consequence of that evolution. So that's what we're going to have a look at today. I may actually come back to the slide a little bit later on, but that was just to reiterate. So we're dealing with a period in history which takes us ultimately, because the fifth wave takes us up to about 3000 BC, but there is a period of overlap between each and every wave that influences, that downloads its holograms and influences the human mind. So don't forget that. So we're really having a look from the birth of creation up to about 3000 years ago. So waves 1 to 5. I think what's important for us to understand, and we've already got a grasp of this, is that evolution itself is a universal process. It is not something that is unique to Earth, to our wonderful little planet that is so beautifully placed relative to the cosmic tree and to our position in the universe. But it's a universal process that takes place on countless planets and through countless star systems and countless realities. And I think it's also, to put it into context, is remember that all 9 waves have always existed. But the process of evolution, it's like you can't be born as a 2-month-old baby and go from there to university, because all of the networks and the development have to actually be laid down in steps and stages in order to be able to elevate us to the evolutionary level where we are more compatible and have access to the 9th wave. But because all of the 9th waves have always existed, it means that there will be planets, people, civilizations, and cultures within our universal framework that are way more advanced than we are, that their sense and aspect of linear time in respect of their progression through the waves doesn't actually match ours. You know, so we're really having a look. We can see the perfection of the 9th wave, of the 9 waves, with our unique Earth timeline. But that doesn't mean to say it's the same timeline that's existed for everybody else. And that's why we do have encoded into ancient mythologies and ancient wisdoms, and we find in modern day terms as well, there's lots and lots of stories of visitors from other planets and highly, highly advanced technologies and understandings of the workings of the universe, because there are civilizations that are way more advanced than we are. So just understanding that. So to just reiterate, the first wave itself was that which provided the primary information for the fundamentals of matter. So it's the foundation of life. It's the glue that holds it all together. All of the systems, the galaxies, the planets, the elements, molecules, crystals, minerals, rocks, and single-celled life, all of that was encoded into the first wave. So it was a very slow process from the initial atoms and first aspects of matter that were created as a consequence of universal mind, of that energy, and the mind holograms that gave birth to fundamentals of matter. And that's why people, sometimes they look at the waves as being hierarchical. In other words, so we've gone beyond the first wave, so therefore we're at the 3rd wave level or the 4th wave level. But we never go beyond it, because if we didn't have the first wave that was still active, everything would fall apart. So without that first wave, we wouldn't exist, and we wouldn't have moved to the level that we are. So all of the waves are actually still active. What is most important is that we see what the impacts of each of the waves has actually been, so that we, with our advancing capacity, can actually play a role in reprogramming that which has been adversely programmed into the manifestation of life. So, so that's the first wave. Second wave was the plants and animals. Excuse me. Now, plants and animals are beautiful and brilliant receivers and transmitters of divine information. We know this from plants and from trees themselves, trees that exist on the planet. They are unfiltered receivers of divine information. They just receive light. They actually transmute that light. They create food with it, and that food then actually supports the entire balance of an ecosystem and distributes the information throughout the ecosystem. So with the second wave, there was already an inherent lifeline to source that was evident through the very manifestation of life itself. And that's why we feel great when we're out in nature and when we're wandering among the trees, when we have that connection with animals, because they're just pure receivers and transmitters. They have no other agendas. It's not that they don't have soul or spirit, because everything is created from the same divine source. They don't have necessarily the capacity, although they are evolving, to think and reason the way we can with our brains, but they are pure and divine conduits for source energy. So our respect for them is really important. What happened also with the second wave is where we get a split into different genders. So we go from normal sort of single-celled organisms that could just reproduce themselves all the time to this split. So it was part of the universal download of mind with the second wave that actually isolated the two genders in the form of different bodies. Even in the plant kingdom, we see that. We see male trees and female trees. So that's why we have, you know, sort of insects pollinating. You know, they transfer pollen from the male tree to the anther of the female flower, and they move from flower to flower. So it's a beautiful relationship in respect of masculine, feminine energies in the plant and the animal kingdoms. Life itself and the life forms that evolved as a consequence of the second wave holograms is run on an instinctual basis, and this is the source of our own instincts as well, because we evolved from that kingdom. So it was the laying down of all of that instinctual information. Birds that navigate in accordance with magnetic fields. We have magnetite in our brain that enables us to navigate the magnetic fields. We've just forgotten how to use it. You know, and that instinctual connection. So the second wave is the source of all of those beautiful instincts that are little pings and messages from source that enable us to navigate life. This was also the first embodiment, for want of a better description, of the ethereal energy. So we moved from the immobile elements, molecules, crystals, rocks that form the foundation of Earth itself, to the mobility of that ethereal energy and the propagation of that ethereal energy through the interaction of those life forms. So all of those life forms as well on the second wave are continuing to evolve, as are we with the new waves. So if we think that plants and basic animal life were birthed as a consequence of, or downloaded with the blueprints, if you like, within the second wave, we see some of that evolution actually happening at the moment in accordance with the new waves that are coming in. And you guys have heard me talk about the sacred white animals on numerous occasions. They were built into prophecy as being foreseen that they would come. They would herald a time when great changes were going to take place upon our planet. And we see that more and more. We also see an evolution and a shift and a change that's happening in the plant kingdom. And now, Mary, I think you've heard this one before. This is in the plant world. With the albino redwoods that have been discovered only in recent years. So it's just a validation for the fact that evolution is continuing even at the second wave level. But the albino redwoods, for those of you that are not familiar with it, they were discovered in recent years. And because they are pure white, it's the same structure as a normal redwood, but they are pure white. So there's no green in their leaves. They have no chlorophyll, which means they cannot capture the sun and they cannot manufacture their own food. So they found in close association with, if you like, normal redwoods. And it was originally thought that because they can't manufacture their own food, that they would be parasitic upon the original redwood. So they'd need to draw the sugars and the water, the food to stay alive from their redwood hosts, their normal redwood hosts. However, on further investigation, what they actually found was a beautiful symbiotic relationship that had developed between these pure white redwoods and the traditional ones, in that the white leaves appear to be holding and concentrating heavy metals within their structure. So it's like what they are doing in return for the food is they are helping to detoxify the environment that us as human beings have actually wrought upon this planet, you know, sort of the really toxic environment that we have created as a consequence of our supposed evolution and lifestyles. So these white redwoods have actually evolved in partnership with the traditional redwoods to help to purify the forests within which they live. And there have been other white-leaved plants in much the same way that have been found. They haven't investigated, I don't think, the heavy metal contents and some of the toxic components of those plants, but what they have found is a number of other plants appearing that have pure white leaves that cannot photosynthesize their own food. But the importance is it's not parasitic. It actually serves a dual purpose because they have far higher levels of toxins than the traditional trees do. So they are acting as a sink to help to draw all the toxins out of the environment. And if we think about the white animals, you know, what we've always said and what ancient prophecies have told us is that the sacred white animals would appear upon the planet when it was a time and signaled a time of great change, when the rivers were running low, you know, sort of when the water was polluted, when the trees are cut down, when the planet is actually in trouble. And what we have seen in the last 2 decades is a huge increase in the numbers of sacred white animals or white animals that are appearing across all species, whether that is the fulfillment of the prophecies in the white buffalo and the white lion, etc. Those have been kept alive through the mythologies and stories of the indigenous peoples of each of those regions. However, we see more and more and more white species actually appearing as they are messengers. So they are telling us that something is actually wrong. It's also been said that they are warning of an impending ice age because in essence, total white fur is camouflaged against snow. So it's actually said that the sacred white animals that are appearing more and more and more are a sign of a climate shift and an impending ice age. So that also gets us to relook at the narrative that is being sprouted at the moment as well about rising global temperatures, climate, global warming, so on, so on, so on. So there's many ways to look at it. However, they are definitely have been appearing in response to the changing times that we are in. So here we get evidence of that evolution continuing at the second wave level, influenced by the 9th wave influx, the advancing waves. Okay, so 3rd wave, we actually saw, as was mentioned on that slide, I think this was, how many million years ago was the 3rd wave, was the birth of primates? It was quite a few million years ago. The birth of primates, this evolution. So the blueprint that was downloaded with the 3rd wave actually helped to evolve some of the animal species from quadrupeds, as in walking on four legs, to bipedal. And this was how the primates evolved. So they moved from walking on four legs to two legs. They also, in accordance with the third wave, there was a, development, which resulted in larger brains. So this is evidenced in accordance with fossil records. So the brain size began to increase. So the brain size needed to increase in order to hold the greater numbers of neuronal connections that go along with the reasoning mind. So the initial primates were not able to rationalize and reason the way that we are. However, their brains increased because it was part of the developmental blueprint that would lead to the manifestation of human beings. So the behaviors, the increased polarization, some of the precursor behaviors that were observed in the initial primates actually are markers for human development. And that's why we see and experience and feel such a kinship, and there is such a similarity with some of the behaviors. You know, we look at some of the great apes, the orangutans, the gorillas, and some of them, how they touch their heart and use sign language to speak. They don't have the vocal equipment that we have, but they can communicate. So there was this initial communication that was established as a consequence of the holographic downloads with the third wave. Which we see embodied in the primates of the animal kingdom. So precursors to human behavior and primary human beings. So the fourth wave, now remember that these waves as well, and that these periods in time, the evolution that we witness as a consequence of the holograms of new waves really happens within a very, very short period of time. So if you remember the graphs I showed you in the first session, where we have the, you know, sort of sudden spikes or increase in species, and then we get, you know, sort of massive extinctions and then new species emerging in relatively short periods of time. So all of this happens rather, the initial appearance happens rather rapidly, and then the integration of those changes takes place gradually over a period of time within the wave activity of that particular delivery, for want of a better description. So the fourth wave, we see initial human beings. So again, we get a further expansion in respect of the brain size and the neural capacity. So this is where you start getting the frontal lobe development, where you start getting a differentiation in respect of the structure and the lobes of the brain and the different brain hemispheres as well. So we've got expanding brains, increase in size. There is an absolute shift in behavior. These initial humans became and were hunter-gatherers. So they were a lot more mobile. They were not quite as territorial as the initial primates would tend to be, and the initial hunter-gatherer humans would have traveled great distances because they would have gone wherever the supplies and the food were. So that would also indicate a change in the functionality of brains. Driven more by instinct rather than reasoning. So the initial fourth wave human beings, the initial human beings, had no concepts of their divine origins. So there are no mythologies that emerge as a consequence of these primary humans. There is no evidence, in a sense, either that they were anything other than almost bridging the evolutionary tree, the evolutionary ladder between the third wave primates and more modern humans. So they were operating instinctually in the same way that the primate kingdom was, and they learned to use tools. Now we can look at primates today and we see how they can actually learn to use basic tools as well. So very, very instinctual, no concept of their divine origins. It was just, you know, part of life. There was no mourning, no concept of that sort of death, if you like. That all started changing with the fifth wave. The holograms of the fifth wave really started our modern journey as human beings. So with the fifth wave, which going back to the chart is about 103,000 years ago, the fifth wave brought with it the blueprints and the downloads for the First Nations people as we know. And this is where everything begins to change really rapidly. So if you go back prior to that, you'll see that, you know, sort of life went for millions of years without change, and then you get step changes which are observed with the incoming waves, but they were really, really long periods of time, so millions of years. What happens with the fifth wave is that the speed with which the changes became evident as much, much more quickly. So here, this takes us back to the increasing frequency of subsequent waves. So the fifth wave we know was like the 20 times faster in frequency and more information enfolded within it than the fourth wave, which was 20 times faster than the third wave. So that's why the speed of evolution and the rate of change actually keeps on increasing with each subsequent wave. So here we find with the fifth wave that there were massive and very rapid changes that began to take place, and we see a lot happening within the fifth wave timeline, for want of a better description. Human beings developed language capability. So we move from just being those fundamentals to developing culture, in a sense. So this was the cultural revolution in respect of human beings. So everything changes. The ability to speak, communicate, even if it was initial grunts and groans, there was there's evidence of a lot of communication in different languages that were created that were pictorial, that initially were hugely symbolic and transmitted in terms of pictures. Massive mental development, the emergence of consciousness, which really means that these individuals, these initial human beings, had the capacity to connect with concepts beyond themselves. So it takes them beyond the boundaries of their own skin. This is the first time when there was this absolute connection with something beyond themselves, which as an unfiltered wave is actually direct connection with the divine source. They had a physically sleeker anatomy, so their whole body shape changed. The fifth wave is unfiltered, so there's like no boundaries, no barriers on it. The mind is actually expanding, the right brain, the left brain, like wide open, hugely connected with otherworldly realms, concepts of divine source, and the origins of all of the First Nations peoples. What they see in the historical records related to the fifth wave is all the evidence of individuals burying their dead, sending their people who had died on a journey into the afterlife. So there was this fundamental understanding of the fact that life doesn't end with the boundary of the skin, that was what started emerging during this fifth wave and was developed in terms of its concepts. It was part of the hologram. Hologram of development that came along and was delivered with the fifth wave. We also see cave paintings dating back sometimes. I think some of the oldest are between 40 and 60,000 years old, where we see an understanding of this and of different life forms that probably didn't exist on the planet, but which indicate altered states of consciousness in which everything became malleable and was viewed and seen in a completely different way. It's like having some of those real otherworldly visions. So some of the cave remnants are up to 75,000 years old. What's interesting, having just been to South Africa as well, I mean, Adam's calendar is an astronomically aligned calendar. It has specific orientations with the alignments with the equinox sunrise, with the solstice sunrise, the solstice sunset. etc. It is aged, estimated to be about 75,000 years old. That is that particular rock formation that was created in South Africa, 75,000 years old. It is also a site where many of the shamans, also up to modern times, are actually initiated. So it was recognized as a portal, a gateway, a conduit to the divine. It's called Adam's calendar. And it was called that way because it related back to first man. And we went to visit it, and we do include that on our South African trip. So we do have and hold a couple of ceremonies up there, and it's really quite fascinating. But it was known as an initiation site for shamans. Many ancient shamans were actually initiated there, and as I say, continue to be so today. So that started many thousands and thousands of years ago. It was a fifth wave manifestation. And what is interesting is we speak about the First Nations peoples. The oldest of those First Nations peoples has been discovered to be, through DNA research, the Khoisan Bushmen in South Africa. They're tracing their DNA heritage back has taken the origin of those peoples back to 80,000 years ago. So that is squarely within the fifth wave emergence of these peoples. So the Khoisan that exist, and they still exist, although very small communities, and that's why it's really important to protect them. They still exist in South Africa. They're just not allowed to live their life in a sense, as they have always done. Their territories, their hunting grounds, etc., have actually been decimated, and they've been reduced to, very similarly what happened with many Native Americans, to enclosed areas and townships that don't facilitate their natural lifestyle. But they are still here, and they still hold the wisdom and the understanding of their connection to source. They understand that they have been here on this planet, even the modern generations, that they have been holding the fifth wave unfiltered source connection on the planet since those peoples were birthed. So it's quite a fascinating understanding. And Sean Caulfield, who was a South African who was very close to a particular group of Khoisan, actually refers to them very often as being the originators of diamond consciousness. So they were the first beings that connected with source, that embodied the purity of that diamond consciousness in human form upon the planet. So that is what the First Nation peoples were. So within the fifth wave, even though there was separation of genders, etc., that unfiltered connection with source balanced the masculine and feminine energies, held them both within the light of source, that there was an ultimate respect and interplay of energies between those life forms, between the masculine and the feminine. Therefore, the initial fifth wave societies, all of them that lived there, they had very clear role definitions for their people, but there was a harmony that existed in the way that they lived. It wasn't only between themselves, it was a harmony that existed between the physical world and the spiritual world, between themselves within their tribal cultures, and between themselves and the animal kingdom. The natural world. There's a respect and an understanding of the natural elements as all being emanations of source, the devas, the wind, the water, everything as being emanations from the one prime source. And if we really think about where things have gone, and the fact that we've only really started awakening in the last 2 decades en masse, it's not surprising that many people have been drawn to exploring these shamanic teachings, because it has awakened the memory of the fact that it is in those teachings that there is something to be accessed. There is something to remember within ourselves through being drawn to the First Nation peoples too. And I'm not talking about go away for a weekend and become a shaman. You know, I mean, that is just, it's not it. And that's where things have actually become distorted. But there is an inherent memory within our beings, because all of the First Nations peoples, whether they be Scandinavian, Siberian, African, South American, North American, whatever they are our ancestors, and we have forgotten our links with them through subsequent waves. So they are all our ancestors, and they all have inherent wisdom. So the fifth wave was also the origin of all creation stories, which were influenced by the cultures that were forming, depending on where they were at geographically, because each culture, each tribal identity would have been influenced by its localized geographic environment, by its interactions with nature. So the creation myths were described and defined and influenced by their particular environments and by their particular ways the storytellers, the shamans, were able to access source and interpret it through their developing brains. So all of the creation stories are influenced by those First Nations cultures. Excuse me, I'm just going to have a bit of a drink. It is the fifth wave is the origin of all burial ceremonies. It's the origin of art, this expression of beauty, because it was something that they were inherently connected with the beauty of divine source expressed through their creations. So it's the origin of art, of ritual, of symbolism. So rituals were created in order to be able to honor that which they knew and inherently understood gave birth to them and to their form. And learning to read the symbolism. So there's huge amounts of symbolism encoded into their mythological story. So it's important that we don't read it only as myth. It's important that we become symbolically literate, because then we understand and we can get to the truths behind those symbols that they were using. So fifth wave is the origin, the original diamond consciousness, and as understood by the human embodiments. Hence our modern fascination with shamanic practices and indigenous peoples. We are trying to bridge the gap, okay, from the ninth down to the fifth. There was also no ego, because the light of the divine, the fifth wave, was unfiltered. So the light shone equally on the left and the right brains, which meant there was no personality did not overtake the spiritual. It was a harmonized relationship. So there was no ego. Not that there was no rational mind necessarily. It's just that the rational mind was actually balanced. The thinking mind was balanced by the creative, intuitive mind working in harmonic relationships. The fifth wave was also the origin of Adam and Eve and all of the stories that have emerged around the birth of the first people. Because Adam and Eve is a symbolic story. So Adam and Eve, the first peoples, were born as a consequence, the first conscious peoples, those that became aware ultimately of the polar opposites of good and evil, birthed with Adam and Eve in the fifth wave. So there is also the mythologies and stories of Atlantis and Lemuria date back to the fringes of the fifth wave bordering on the sixth wave. So there's an interesting take on Atlantis and Lemuria as a consequence of understanding the waves and the progression that has actually happened since then. So that's just what I would like to share with you, because I think each one has their own understanding, you know, and so many people in modern day terms, without understanding the origin of the stories, you know, they kind of go, oh, you know, we're busy recreating Atlantis. And I'm going, we don't really want to do that, because Atlantis was runaway technology that did not serve, that we're still feeling the effects of today in our modern day world. So I'll go on to that in a moment, but I just wanted to share this with you because this is a wonderful example of the meaning that can be found within symbols and symbolism. So this comes from a wonderful thinker and researcher by the name of Michael Tsarian, and I think it was when the quote is his. Michael Tsarian's quote: "In ancient mythology and history, the symbols of the tree and the serpent have always denoted women or the feminine principle and the mysteries in their keeping." So we have the tree. So we have the tree, which was what gave shape, definition, and form to the universe, which was there at the birth of the universe, associated with feminine principle. We have the serpent, which represents the waves that were emanating, the 9 waves that were actually emanating from the tree at the center. So the tree and the serpent are inextricable, and the mysteries in their keeping. You see where the serpent mythology has become distorted. Because we think about the waves as a sine wave, those ancient peoples connected with this whole concept of the birth of creation with a central feminine force and understood that, and that the waves carried the mysteries. You know, and that there is so much in respect of the holograms that is actually carried in the information that's carried in the waves. We haven't even unpacked it all because our brain has been developing along with it. But this image is just really, really beautiful because it actually combines the concepts of the tree, where the woman is actually the trunk of the tree, the leaves, and the serpent in one beautiful image that relates back to ancient wisdom and understanding. So the tree of life is the origin or gateway to the great mystery, and the serpent are the waves or the emanations. So beautiful correlations with ancient wisdom. Now, I have to say to you ladies, I have just, the screen on my computer has actually just gone into battery saver mode, which means, well, I couldn't find the charger thing. It means that the computer is draining as a consequence of this. So I may only have about 10 minutes left. So I may have to cut this short, or wherever it is by the time the computer shuts down, because I wasn't able to find the power thing, and then continue it next week. So as long as you're okay with that, so I'm just warning you that it might only continue for another 5 minutes. Okay. So here's some more insight for you. And that is that the Hebrew word for Eve is Hava, meaning mother of all things, as well as serpent. So when you get that the serpent appeared to Eve, well, no, actually, Eve is synonymous with the serpent or the wave, that feminine form, the mother of all things. Arabic words for snake, life, and teaching are closely related to the word Eve, the word or the name Eve. So we find that theme continued through the etymology of Arabic words. The concept of the Great Mother, the creative feminine principle, informed the cultures arising, emanating from the fifth wave mind. So remember, each wave is a hologram of universal mind. It downloads specific information and principles, which then governs the development of life. So this concept of the Great Mother was actually downloaded with that hologram, which is where those indigenous peoples got it from. And if we look at that, there was a great reverence and respect of many of the original cultures. There was a huge respect for the female feminine energy that was viewed as being, you had the crones, you had the wise women. They were always the ones that people went to for the healing, for the wisdom, for the oracles. So they guided the tribe. And this is what we've said, is that the feminine principle is the initiator, that the masculine energy then acts upon the guidance of. So this is something that was provided and understood as an aspect of the fifth wave, and these goddess-based or feminine-led cultures. Very, very prominent in the entire fifth wave era from 103,000 years ago. They were still prevalent around the Mediterranean around 1500 BC, by which time the sixth wave was actually starting to encroach upon those areas. By 500 AD, they had all but disappeared and been overrun by the patriarchy. So we see a transition period from the fifth wave to the sixth wave in the fact that these female-led cultures were prominent. They were the blueprint for successful societies at that time. Okay, so I hope I'm going to be able to get through this really quickly at the moment, and that is the understanding of the origin of trauma and the birthing of the ego, because the ego that we live with now, that we are working to reintegrate into our being, was birthed in the transition period between the fifth and the sixth waves. So the fifth wave, for many, many tens of thousands of years, those cultures and societies lived harmoniously. Something disrupted the harmony. The ego was birthed as a means of protection. So it helps us to protect our core. We create defensive postures, defensive behaviors to protect ourselves. That's what the ego does. You know, that's the purpose that it serves. The only thing is we have given it ultimate sovereignty and respect of governing everything about our lives. So the ego is birthed as a consequence of trauma. So if the human psyche was fractured all of those thousands of years ago, what was it that caused the fracturing of the psyche? So this is where some of the mythologies become really interesting, because the fifth wave indigenous peoples, they all hold stories about visitors from the stars, ET races that were not born of this earth. And there are many different types. Some refer to archons, some actually refer to the Draco, whatever it may, the reptilians, whatever it may be. But there are stories that have survived about races from other planets that came to Earth and disrupted and impacted the natural process and progress. One could say it disrupted, but then when we have a look at the future waves, we'll see how it all fits in. But Atlantis and the development of Atlantis was an intervention. There was not a natural development of societies on Earth. It was highly technological, highly patriarchal, very, very much about control. So it was Atlantis was birthed as a consequence of, and this a lot comes from the work of Michael Tazarian, who's a brilliant, brilliant researcher as well, that the ET sixth wave has interfered with natural progress and evolution as it was moving. They also were responsible for genetic manipulation, and the entire purpose and intention behind what they were doing was the creation of a slave race or slave species that would obey. And obey who is obey the patriarchy. So it required the diminishment of the feminine and female led cultures, the female prominence and respective thinking, behaving in the way that those societies were structured. So with their advanced technologies and the genetic manipulation, there was a whole society that actually built up that harnessed the labor power of the cultures of that time within the Atlantean culture that had been created upon the surface of our planet. crystal resources, the ability to use electromagnetic waves, the ability to utilize sound for healing, for all sorts of things. A lot of that technology was brought as a consequence of the ET visitors. There is evidence of the fact that they're highly, highly advanced structures and technologies still exist upon our planet that doesn't align with the indigenous peoples. But it's evidence of another race of beings that was actually here. And a lot of people really still look for Atlantis as being an island or a continent or a place, as opposed to Atlantis being a culture that was spread out over the planet. So it was a highly technological culture. They were individuals that had developed in accordance with subsequent waves that brought their distorted perspective of sixth and seventh wave technology into being upon planet Earth. So humans were interfered with, and they were enslaved. Now, it is believed, and the mythology goes, that Lemuria, or Mu, preceded Atlantis. And Mu is referred to or translates as the place of the ancestors, which is really interesting. So it's the place of our human ancestors. Some of the research that Michael Tazarian has done indicates that the Lemurians were actually a breakaway group from Atlantis. So the interference with humans, the genetic manipulation, the enslavement, being forced against their will to do things for other people that was not part of their natural way of being, their natural unfiltered connection with the divine, was hugely traumatizing for them. So this began the birthing of the trauma. There was, and they did remain, clusters or groupings of original Fifth Nation peoples in various places that could see what was happening and sought to rescue some of those who had been enslaved and bring them back into a harmonious, to sort of re-educate them back into the harmonious way of being. Not all of them wanted to leave because they had discovered powers through the technology that had actually begun to reform and reformat some of their brains. But those that did were brought back to Lemuria, which is part and parcel of the Hawaiian Islands in the Pacific. That was what became the Lemurian culture, those who had been rescued from Atlantis. So it was a breakaway group and those that had broken away from the enslavement of Atlantis that formed Lemuria. So in essence, Lemuria post-dated or was as a consequence of Atlantis. So it was just a really interesting concept that I just wanted to share with you. However, there was a lot of conflict between the indigenous races, this sort of rescuing of perceived slaves to actually take them back. The Atlanteans didn't like that, so there was more genetic manipulation, more trauma caused to the human psyche. There were also then wars that resulted utilizing crystals and weapons. So they were, and there, if you look at one of the sounds like today, yeah, exactly, you see why, you know, when people say they want to recreate Atlantis, I kind of go, no, you don't. So in one of the most ancient of texts that exists, it's the Mahabharata, which is, I think it's an ancient Hindu text. They do describe, and other places as well, where there is evidence and there are descriptions of nuclear wars. Okay, Mary is saying, yeah,